Welcome to Design Insights podcast. I'm your host Jashu Nagrale and today's guest is Kristie Fischer. We are going to be speaking about AI, ML and human-centered AI design.
Best results, so like the greatest predictions or the most efficient workflows, are where the AI is sort of augmenting or assisting the human intelligence.
Kristie, thank you so much for coming on the show. We are so excited to have you. Could you start by giving us a little intro about yourself and what you do at Google?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Kristie Fischer, and I am the lead of the UX research team for Stadia Games and Entertainment at Google. Stadia is Google's new cloud streaming game platform, and Stadia Games and Entertainment makes games for the Stadia platform. Prior to working on Stadia, I've also worked on the Google Ads team as well as the G Suite team, in particular on Gmail and some ML-driven productivity tools.
Kristie, you wrote in one of your publications that says machine learning works best when users don't have to think twice. I feel that's a very powerful and a very beautiful line because as designers, we tend to design products which minimize the decisions to be made by users and which minimize the number of sad smileys in the user journey graph. How can human-centered AI design help designers create such products that make it easy for the user to use them?
First and foremost, you have to make sure that machine learning is solving a problem that only machine learning can solve, and that it's actually solving a real user problem. A challenge that we saw a lot in the early days of designing for machine learning at Google was that it was really tempting for a lot of our machine learning engineers to just look at what data do we have and then try to figure out what cool algorithms they could make with those data. And what would end up happening is that we would do something that was really technically impressive, but it didn't actually solve a real problem for users. And in some cases, it could create more work for them. So first and foremost, it's important to make sure you're starting with a real user problem that only machine learning can uniquely solve. And secondly, so much testing and iteration, starting with a problem and then testing and iterating. And so making sure that as the machine learning model is evolving, that you're checking in and making sure that it's actually working in a way that is meaningfully enhancing the user's experience and not causing additional confusion or frustration with the mystery of what the algorithm is doing. It's interesting because one of the things that I think is a recurring theme in technology is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. So even though artificial intelligence and machine learning is a relatively new technology and we're still wrapping our heads around how to use it, how to be effective and efficient with it, it's the same principles still apply. So the same idea of human-centered design doesn't really change. The only difference is you need to understand the unique ways that AI can cause challenges for you as a designer, and also that it just works in a different way. So human-centered AI is developing AI with the human-centered design lens and doing it with people at the center rather than technology at the center, which is what good designers are always doing anyway.
You mentioned that AI can actually cause challenges to us as designers. Could you elaborate on how that is and if there's something that designers should look out for?
Yeah, so machine learning algorithms are inherently probabilistic. So you'll never be able to predict with 100% certainty what output they will deliver. So let's say you're designing a recommendations UI. Let's say you work for like a video streaming service, something like Netflix, and you have some recommendations that are being surfaced to the user. You as a designer have control over what that UI might look like and maybe where it appears and how many recommendations are surfaced, but you will never be able to know with 100% certainty what the AI is going to deliver to the user, if that recommendation is going to be really amazing or really terrible. And that's where you have to partner really, really closely with the engineers who are actually developing the AI. But because there is that inherent uncertainty, you as a designer will never 100% be confident exactly what the user is seeing at that moment. And that's what's really unique and uniquely challenging about developing with AI.
As designers, we need to decide What are the problems only an ML can solve? Do we have like a best practice sort of framework around it wherein we can confidently say that, you know what, this may not be an ML job? Where do we draw that line?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk about this explicitly and give a worksheet with like a step-by-step discussion guide and sort of thinking guide for designers and their teams in the People Plus AI Guidebook. The People Plus AI Guidebook is a resource that Google released in May of 2019. And that is one of the exact topics that we tackle in the user needs and defining success chapter. So when you're thinking about what is a problem that AI is uniquely suited to solve, some things to consider are what are the risks of failure? So for example, if it's a very, very high stakes scenario or something very personal to the user, like let's say if you're asking the user to hand over AI control to an AI to send a birthday card to their mom, that might not be a great problem for AI to solve because failure would be really challenging. Whereas something like, again, movie recommendations, the chance of or the consequences of failure there are much lower because, you know, worst case scenario, the user just continues looking for a movie to watch that they like. So thinking about both the user's needs as well as the consequences, as well as the complexity of the task, as well as what a solution looks like without AI. So if the number of steps for the user to do it manually versus for the user to do it with AI is way, way different, such that the AI might save lots and lots of time, then maybe it's a great solution. If there's not a huge difference, then maybe it's not worth your company's time and resources to develop that AI. So those are all the sorts of things, as well as many others that we talk about in that chapter of the People Plus AI Guidebook.
I think the guidebook seems like a great place to start for anyone who is getting started with AI or someone who is well versed and say their company is kind of starting on a new product or maybe trying to add some features into an already existing product. Let us talk about designing products. There are products who would do well with AI, ML, and then there are products who may or may not do well. So is there any profound differences that you have seen, at least in design?
There may be things surfaced in your interface that you don't have control over as a designer. That's something that's very new. But generally speaking, piece of guidance that I would offer to people designing for AI is to think about what we call augmented intelligence. So this idea of like, you can have a process that's completely governed by AI, or you can have an interface where it's only the user and they're not being assisted by any kind of AI. But what we've often seen is that the best results, so like the greatest predictions or the most efficient workflows, are where the AI is sort of augmenting or assisting the human intelligence. So a user is really good at deciding which piece of information is most important to them in the moment. They're also really good at inferring emotions. Machines are very, very bad at these things, and it will be many decades before AI is able to be as good at those things as humans. But AIs are really, really good at processing thousands of data points in the span of a second and maybe remembering things, whereas humans are really good at forgetting things and we have this recency bias. And so if you think about it, when you have those two strengths working together, you can get to a better result than just the AI or just the human working on their own.
Kristie, this is beautiful because why choose when you can have both, right? And if you could maybe give us an example of something that you have experienced, bringing the best of these both worlds together in a design, that would be the cherry on the cake.
Absolutely. So a lot of hospitals are experimenting with AI-assisted diagnoses. And so, you know, doctors are experts and they often have knowledge about a patient and they have you know, additional context about what's going on that a machine doesn't have. That being said, a machine might be able to reference thousands and thousands of MRI images on a tumor and be able to compare and see like just how different a tumor for one patient is versus other patients. So what they found is that if you show an AI an image of a tumor on an MRI and you ask the AI, like, is this a cancerous tumor? Yes or no? The prediction that the AI will make is going to be like X% accurate. And then if you show the doctor, it's going to also be like, certain accuracy. But if you have the doctor work with the prediction of the AI, then it's the best possible accuracy. Maybe the AI will say, hey, based on this part of the image and this part of the image, the AI is 80% confident this is cancer. And the doctor can maybe look at that and say, okay, maybe I should pay extra attention and then put this piece of information together with the context that I have about the patient and maybe the patient's history. And based on those two things together, they can make more accurate diagnoses than either the doctor alone or the AI alone.
It makes complete sense because great experiences come out when humans and machines work together and have the and relationship instead of or. So I think augmented, at least for the next decade or so, is the way to go. Are there any best practices or industry standards, maybe design principles that a designer should be aware of when they are designing for ML specific interfaces?
Yeah, there are a lot. We go over them in the guidebook. And I'd like to say as well that I'm actually very impressed that Google's not the only company that's been working over the past year to try to release guidelines for not just ethics in developing AI and ways of making sure your data is not biased, but also design guidelines. So I just want to recognize that there are a lot of great resources out there from a lot of places. I'm of course particularly proud of Google's People AI Guidebook, but I would just encourage everyone to just soak up all of the great information that's already out there. So a couple of things to keep in mind that people often don't design for at the beginning is one, ability for the user to provide feedback, and working with the engineers to make sure that the feedback can actually be implemented into the system and change the predictions over time. So what do I mean? For example, let's say you are using Google Photos and you are trying to search for images of your pet cat. If you do this and then cats appear that are not your cat, and you have no way of telling Google Photos like, hey, that's not my cat, then you're having a bad experience and you're frustrated, but the algorithm has no way of learning from your frustration. But if instead you provide a way for the user to say like, hey, algorithm, that's not my cat, then if that gets fed back into the AI model, then over time it can learn better. So this idea of from the very beginning thinking about if and when and how the user will be able to provide feedback about the results of an AI prediction that can then make the AI better over time, it's actually very complicated to do well, because you have to make sure you're not overburdening the user and making it feel like they're doing work for the system, but still allow them to flag when something's not right. And then B, you have to work really closely with your engineering team to make sure that the feedback from the user is getting implemented in the right way. So if something that if you can think about that from the very beginning, can set you up for success. And I have plenty of examples from my time at Google of teams that didn't think about this early enough and then had to kind of scramble once the product was in beta phase and they realized like, oh, we need to like get this in before launch. So you can save yourself a lot of time by thinking about it ahead of time. So that's just one example, but there are lots of other unique considerations when dealing with AI that we talk about in the guidebook.
We are going to jump into the guidebook just after this one question. Speaking about feedback, there are like two types of feedback: the ones you observe and get, and the ones you receive from the users. For these systems that are intelligent, for these systems that learn specifically over a duration of usage and a duration of time, which one of these feedback would you prefer, and what kinds of feedback should we be measuring?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we call those like implicit signals and explicit signals, with implicit signals being just logs of the user's behavior that the system can detect. And then the explicit being like the user actually saying like 5 stars, 1 star, thumbs up, thumbs down. And which one is right for your product really just depends on who your user is, what your product is. But the thing to think about is making sure that you're defining success properly. So, and that you can actually interpret all of this signal. So, for example, let's say if you decided that the number one definition of success was just the user spending as much time as possible in your product, and so you're only using that implicit signal as feedback to your AI, that would mean that if the AI is making a prediction that makes the user spend longer in the product, it's counting that as a success, and it's saying to itself, do more of that, do more of that, do more of that. And that might seem good on the surface, but without additional information, you might be misinterpreting what that extra time means. What if it means that the AI is actually causing the user confusion with its recommendations? And so the user is spending longer in your product because they're having to just spend more time correcting it and figuring out workarounds. Or there's a case of early in the days of YouTube AI-driven recommendations, YouTube was recommending a lot of what we'd call like clickbait type videos, like, look at these terrible parents, what they're doing to their kids, or like, look at this crazy snake. And it was like these kind of trashy videos where you might kind of click on them in the moment in spite of your better judgment, but over time it was causing people to not want to spend more time in YouTube. So, and that was happening because the AI was only taking into account, did the user click on the video? It wasn't taking into account any other signals. So eventually they changed that, and they started using a lot more signals to make sure that they were really giving more quality recommendations. So all of this is to say, there's a place for both implicit and explicit feedback into the system. And if you're only going to be relying on logs on user behavior to determine success or failure of the system, you have to make sure that you're really accurately interpreting what those logs mean, because just something like clicks or additional time might be misleading in terms of what the actual user experience is.
Perfect. So a combination of all the feedback that you receive, both implicit and explicitly. Let's talk about the guidebook. What is it? How does someone get their hands on it? What do we do once we have downloaded it? And how do we design interesting, meaningful, and intelligent systems using it?
The People Plus AI Guidebook is available publicly at design.google/AI Guidebook. And AI Guidebook is more of like a miniature textbook. And what it's meant to do is it's actually meant to give frameworks and worksheets for you and your team to guide your thinking and make sure you're identifying any unknown unknowns, if you will. So how we recommend you use it is that you sit down with your team and you go through the topics or the chapters that you think are most relevant to the design challenges that you're facing. And there are examples and worksheets for you to work through as a team. So for example, like sitting down as a team for an hour and talking through like, how do we define success for our product and how do we measure it and make sure that we are doing it in a way that's human-centered, and that's going to lead to the best outcomes. So it's like a really step-by-step guide for how to think through these problems. Of course, every product is unique, so it's not just like, here's what to do, because we can't tell you what to do, but we can tell you how to best think about it and how to make sure you're avoiding pitfalls and that you are setting yourself up for success by learning through all of the lessons that the Google design teams have learned throughout the years. The guidebook is updated regularly. In fact, we just updated it with something called Explorables. And those are these interactive information visualizations that describe AI concepts like hidden bias, like measuring fairness. And there's a team at Google called the People Plus AI Research Team. So you'll see the connection there, People Plus AI Guidebook, People Plus AI Research. And it's kind of a collective of people across Google, including myself, who work on these sorts of resources. And the People Plus AI Research Team, there's a link to other resources that they provide that are on the guidebook site. And they are tools for exploring your data sets. They are tools for helping you assess bias, and also tools for just teaching you basic concepts of machine learning.
Do you have any stories of products that have immensely benefited from the inclusion of AI ML? And we would also love to hear stories of the opposite happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. There's so many. So I think a great case study that's still evolving at Google is Gmail. So Gmail has always tried to find little ways that weren't even didn't even require AI to help users. So, for example, if you accidentally hit send too fast, this like undo send button appears, or if you say, see the attached document and you didn't attach something, something pops up. And those sorts of little things make the product feel intelligent and make it feel like it's helping you, but it didn't require any sort of sophisticated machine learning. What they have done that has required a lot of sophisticated machine learning, especially for natural language processing algorithms, is their new smart reply features. So more and more people are relying on mobile as their primary device. I think especially in countries like India, where people are kind of coming online and primarily using only their phones more than laptops or other devices. And it's hard to type long responses on email. So they've been developing all these really interesting tools that will allow you to basically, like with just a couple of taps, write an email response. So the first version of this was called Smart Reply, and basically, if you get an email and you're on your phone, there are little options appear where you can just like send a quick reply, like "Got it," "Acknowledge," "Thank you," and then they've evolved that over time. So now you'll see that they actually start with like a bit of a phrase, and you can swipe to like complete, and so it can actually predict very simple, basic responses. And a lot of our emails are just pretty straightforward responses like, hey, when you are available for our next meeting. And so it's been able to learn over time and then help the user just more quickly complete emails on the go. And I think that that's really benefited, and we're going to see even more and more benefits of that over time. During development of certain Google products, we have definitely had missteps or things that we kind of discovered as we were going that we ended up having to change. And I can give some examples of where AI just like wasn't adding a lot of benefit. So one is a YouTube example I mentioned in the past, where if you're not defining success properly, your AI can be having some long-term detriments to your product. So if you're just looking at clicks in this case, they ended up optimizing for things that you might click on, but not actually find valuable and really useful to you over time. Other examples where if the AI prediction is not going to be accurate enough, it might cause more work. So for example, that smart reply option I told you about in Gmail, because the training data set initially was pretty limited, and it was mostly coming from personal email. We found during the beta testing phase, and we were just sort of using it internally at Google, we found that one of the most common responses that it would suggest is "I love you," because when when regular people are writing non-work emails, that's actually a pretty common response, or like part of a kind of sign off of an email. And what we were finding is not only was that not a very useful response, it was actually distracting. And so, it was, people were spending time like reading and being confused about these responses, and it made them scared to tap on any response, just in case they would like accidentally tap the wrong one. So those bad predictions were causing more harm than help, and so we had to make some explicit corrections to make sure that we were surfacing different types of responses depending on the context of whether it's a business email address or a personal email address.
Interesting. I have used Gmail and that feature extensively. In fact, on my phone, I just swipe for my emails.
One of the hypothetical examples I gave in the article, Predictably Smart, is if you were to rearrange UI for a user in order to helpfully reorder suggestions so that the thing that they most want is at the top. That sounds like a good idea in theory, but what it could do is harm the user's ability to habituate to an interface, and then they would waste time looking for the option that they came to click on, rather than have their time saved by having the most useful at the top. There were some experimental projects in the early days of Gmail, again, as we were kind of experimenting with all of these interesting AI productivity tools of, could we reorder somebody's inbox to be, with the most helpful things on top? And again, we found that that is often really challenging, because if you don't get it 100% right, then people are confused and they spend more time looking for things. So there are a lot of examples of how AI can't help, and it really just depends on, again, how important accuracy is, how accurate your algorithm is, what is the user's need, and what are the trade-offs of perhaps their ability to habituate to an AI or habituate to a user interface if the AI is constantly, making changes to what they see.
So in that case, how would we design? So if there are some features that are suggested by the AI, and then there are some features that remain constant. So how do we mix that? How would we design it?
So again, there are no perfect solutions. We don't have the right answers, but one suggestion that I put in the article Predictably Smart on the Google Design blog is to have a predictably unpredictable space of the interface. So for example, if there's a spot that's always like, here are suggestions, and that spot of the UI never changes, but the suggestions surface there do change, and then everything else is never moved. That allows the option for the AI to be smart and like make those helpful suggestions to the user without harming their ability to habituate to the UI and still find the things that they know they want to find manually. So what's helpful about that is that it'll make sure the user can still manually find everything they want to find, but it still offers the ability for the AI to surface helpful suggestions and to learn over time what is going to be the most useful to users. So if you are confident that the AI suggestions for your product are really enhancing the user's experience and really adding value and helping them with whatever it is that your product is designed to do, then great, keep them. If it turns out that really it doesn't make that much of a difference and doing it the non-intelligent way is just as useful to the user, then maybe it's not worth the engineering effort to keep it up. So this is why it's so important to define success criteria for your product and be able to measure it in a way that you can be really confident is true.
Perfect. This makes complete sense. And I am so excited to see all the amazing products and interfaces designers and the product teams and the engineering teams would combine and create. And it's like a co-creation with machines, right? And it can only get better from here. So these are interesting times. Kristie, speaking a little bit about your personal career growth and career journey, are there some things that you have done in your career so far that have given you that boost? And are there people who have helped?
Absolutely. So a lot of people have helped me and given me advice. And one thing I'm sure to always tell students who ask me for advice is that the cost to you of getting advice is that you have to promise to continue to give advice to others as you go on in your career. Nobody figures out career growth on their own, and it's really important to kind of give back to others when you have received advice yourself. My biggest piece of advice is just to ask as many questions as possible to as many people as possible. If a student reaches out to me on LinkedIn with a detailed message that's like, hi, I'm really interested in pursuing XYZ in my career. I see that you do XYZ. Can you answer these 3 questions to me? I almost never turn them down, because it's really, really important to reach out, and there's no other way to get that information without that. The other thing is that, especially for UX, you really have to learn by doing. And sometimes that might mean working on your own project, or sometimes doing work for free if you want to get into the industry. So there's lots of different ways to try to build those skills and get that information. And a lot of times you just have to be really proactive and find people to reach out to, both within your organization and on the internet.
Perfect. Asking questions is something that has helped me in my career as well. And to be honest, there's never a dumb question. Rather just put it out and get no answer than have it and wonder about it. Speaking of people, did you have quote unquote mentors or sponsors to help you on the way out? And what would you suggest for someone who is looking out for them?
Biggest mentors to me throughout my career have been my managers. I've been really fortunate to work at companies that have wonderful people who are really helpful with helping me work backwards from my career goals. I have also gotten a lot of great mentorship just from my peers. So, my peers when I was in graduate school, as well as my peers when I was doing contracted work at Microsoft while I was still in graduate school before I finished my PhD and entered into the full time role. Um, and yeah, mentorship can come from anywhere because, as I love to say, expertise is relative. So if you're even just 1 or 2 years ahead of your career, you can help somebody who's just 1 or 2 years behind. Or even if you're both at the same place, everyone has a different perspective and a different set of skills and superpowers. And so mentorship can happen at any level. And again, it's often just about explicitly asking.
Completely agree. So is there any right way, or let me ask, is there any wrong way of asking someone to be your mentor?
Yeah, fair enough. So I'd say that the wrong way is if you're making it purely transactional, and if you're like, I want mentorship, but really all you want is just a referral. And you're like, what minimum information do I have to give you so that you can help me get a job at Google? That's not really a growth mindset, and that's not really the type of that's not really how it works. Um, and I think the best way of asking for mentorship is to be really explicit about what you're trying to achieve and why you think that person can mentor you and what specifically you want to learn. So just saying like, hey, my name is Kristie, will you be my mentor? That's not as useful or as clear as saying, hi, my name is Kristie. I'm really trying to learn more about artificial intelligence and how it applies to my work. And eventually, I want to grow my career so that I can be an expert in this and use that as I go forward in my journey. I know that you have knowledge about these specific parts of artificial intelligence. Would you mind meeting with me 3 times over the next 3 months to have a conversation about these topics? Now it's very clear, like, what you want, why you've chosen to reach out to me, and how I can help.
Seriously, it was so amazing. Other things that you might want to add that I have not asked. Is there anything that you would want to convey to our listeners?
The one thing I'll say is that artificial intelligence and machine learning are still very new fields, and there's still a lot that we're learning about how to best implement this technology in a way that is most helpful for users and that we can ensure fairness and quality of data. So nobody has all the answers. If anyone tells you they have all the answers, they're lying. So we really just have to approach this with an open mind and constantly be challenging our own assumptions and asking lots of questions. And if you do that, then you're more likely to come out with a successful outcome. And good luck.